Chapter 8. Smart is good, lucky is better. Smart and lucky is best of all. Neef's rules for Changling. Carlyle dragged us out of the closet and into a riot of screaming and wailing like banshee families reunion. I shut my eyes and clamped my hands over my ears. It didn't help. Besides, I couldn't stand not knowing what I was facing. I peeked through my eyelashes at the sea of boogeyman. They were every color of the rainbow, and then some bristling with horns and antennae and spines and spikes and teeth. I closed my eyes again. Okay, it's important to know what you're dealing with, but sometimes the problem is too big to look at all at once. Ladies and gentlemen, honored patrol of brats, buzzed Carlyle, his mind voice smug and confident. Let me tell you a little something about my candidates for this year's Louise Awards. Well, he wasn't talking directly to me. I could tune the tango out and think about other things, like how he couldn't possibly fit 300 boogeymen into his nest. We must be somewhere else, somewhere big. Maybe with exits I could see. I forced my eyes open a second time and studied my surroundings. I was standing on a raised stage at one end of the immense hall lit by giant chandeliers, like sculpted ice. Carlyle stood between me and the blur of the color that had to be unluckily named mortal child. Garlands of flower fairies draped the mirror panels along the walls, and a couple of long tables piled high with fairy food and balloons stood waiting in the back. I didn't see any windows or doors. The boogeyman laughed hideously at something Carlyle said, and the chorus of panic-stricken screaming swelled to a fever pitch behind me. Turning, I saw the seething mass of scarlet faces and roaring mouths, grabbing hands and squirming bodies. It took me a breather to realize they belonged to naughty children, pinned up in a big brass cage at the back of the platform. The boogeymen were less terrifying. Carlyle pulled me around again, but not before I noticed that there were a space between the cage and the back wall. As you can see, Carlyle buzzed, they're a pair of hooligans. Disgustingly dirty, of course, but that's the least of it. This one, he shoved the mortal child forward, is driving her parents to the edge of madness. She is stubborn. She's disobedient. She's destructive. She's incredibly rude. She throws tantrums, and she never says she's sorry. This one, he shoved me up beside her, is even worse. She's broken the geese set on her by the genius of Central Park, and disrupted the soulless dance. She's not sorry either. Just look at the sullen pout. Have you ever seen one hardened case? 300 pairs of yellow, poison green, and scarlet eyes fixed themselves on me. I blinked hard and glanced back. I wasn't some stupid, wild mortal who didn't know what was what. I was the Central Park Changeling, and I wasn't going to cry. I came pretty close, though. What saved me was a small brown turtle. I felt something trickling my foot, and when I looked, there it was, clambering purposefully across my toes. There was a stir among the boogeymen. A hand appeared from nowhere and grabbed the turtle by its shell. Gotcha, said the hand's owner. Bad Skipper-D, skittling off like that. Do you want to be switched flat? It was a Louise. Her hair was dried grass, and her belly hanged out over the waistband of her pleated black skirt, except for the red bow in her hair and the pink unties that showed whenever she bent over. She was paper white outlined in black, with sketched in feathers. I'd never seen anything like her before, and I hoped I never did again. Eloise scrambled her feet and squared me with a beady black glare. "Here's what I like," she announced, "playing with turtles." She stuck Skipperdy's nose against mine, so I was looking cross-eyed into its little turtley face. It opened and shut its mouth unhappily and retreated into its shell. "Here's what I hate. Being bored. Being bored is not allowed. A lettuce leaf makes a nice hat." She spun around and collapsed at the edge of the stage with her black and white legs sprawling, and tossed Skipperdy from hand to hand. I knew how he must feel. "See," Carlyle projected triumphantly, "Eloise likes them." "Eloise is bored out of her mind," shouted a boogeyman in the back. "And so am I. One of them is rude? Don't make me laugh, Birdman. What, that's wuss stuff. My kid would eat her for breakfast." "Yeah," shouted another one. "You got nothing, Carlyle. You hear me? Nothing." "On the contrary," Carlyle objected, "I have a great deal. I have the girl who broke up the social stance single-handedly, and I have her exact twin, who may not have an actual juvenile delinquent, but is, I think you'll agree, undeniable naughty. And what do you have, pray tell? A boy tied his sister to a tree and forgot about it? I rest my case." "Her exact twin?" I turned and really looked, at Carlyle's surprise. She was staring at the nearest changeler, as if it was the only thing in the room. Her body was roundish, and so was her face. Her eyes were hazel, and her mouth kind of tucked at the corners. Her hair sprang in wild brown corkscrews around her head. It looked uncombed and unkempt, and it would have looked the way no matter what. I know. I have the same hair, and the same face, eyes, and mouth. If she'd been barefoot and wearing a spider silk dress instead of sandals, a long blue skirt, and a jacket embroidered all over with flowers, even I couldn't have told us apart. Carlyle's surprise wasn't a mortal child at all. She was a fairy changeling. My fairy changeling. I'd always known how I come to live in New York between. As Tris had often told me about the story of the kidnapper from the Bureau of Changelings Affairs, had chosen me out of all the little girls in the New York outside to be the official changeling of Central Park. She hadn't said a word about the fairy changeling left behind in my place, and I hadn't asked. I was more interested in hearing about me. Carlyle's mind voice broke into my shock. "Just look at them," he was saying, "like two peas in a pod. What are the changes? Do you think of finding them in two different realities and bringing them together? I should get points just for that." "You should just be dequalified, you mean?" yelled a boogeyman in front. He was kind of maybe. with huge red eyes and usual mouthful of nasty teeth. He wasn't on any of the list I've learned. Someone must have made him up. Oh. Yeah, a dog-headed boogeyman said. That one on the right. She's not even mortal. Not mortal? Carlyle scoffed. She smells more mortal. Her parents treat her like a mortal. She's growing up and getting older. That's what mortals do, isn't it? The boogeyman weren't impressed. There were cries of cheat and not fair and what does Louise say? Louise scrambled to her feet and stood on the tips of her little black Mary Janes, holding Skipper D over her head and both hands. Here's what I say, she screeched. Bear pile! And she drove into the crowd of boogeyman head first. A bright green boogeyman unhinged his jaw and roared. Carlyle shifted into a raven and flew at him, scaly claws spread. This seemed like a perfect time to escape. If only I could find a way out. I do not like this dream. My fairy twin my my fairy twin had transferred her attention from all the Changler to storm-tossed sea of boogeymen. Her arms crossed, and her head was sort of tucked down in the collar of her jacket, like Skipper D in his shell. I could hardly stand to look at her. Was my face really that round and piggy? And was my voice really that ugly? I mean, next to the silver music of most fairy voices, I knew my voice was flat and coarse, but inside my head it didn't sound nearly as bad as hers. A small red boogeyman came hurtling over my head, bounced against the cage of naughty children, and flew back into scrimmage. There's got to be a door, I said. Boogeymen can't walk through walls. Boogeymen do not exist. Then we've got nothing to worry about, do we? My therapist says that dreams, however subjectively frightening, have no objective reality. It would be irritational to be frightened. I glared at her. She didn't notice. I walked to the back of the stage just as I had thought. The little space behind the cage of naughty children was big enough to squeeze through. Once I got past them, I could jump off the stage and crawl along the wall, checking the mirrors as I went to see if any of them opened to or transported me somewhere. It wasn't the best idea in the world, but it was the best one I could come up with. The fairy changeling appeared beside me. Can you read Kenji? Kanji? Can I read what? Kenji, she pointed at one of the mirrors. There is a sign over the door, but I cannot read it. It is in Japanese or possibly Chinese. Japanese is written in Chinese characters called Kenji. She started to tell me more about Kenji, but I interrupted her. You can see doors? Yes, there are 3, one in the center of each wall. I believed her, of course. If she said she saw a door, there was a door, without being able to see a sign. I didn't know where it led, but anywhere was better than where I was. Unfortunately, I was going to have to bring her with me. Listen, I said, we're going to move very slowly to the side of the stage, and then we're going to slip behind the cage and crawl along the wall to the nearest door, and then we're going to go through it. Then will I wake up? Maybe, I said cautiously. You can't tell until you've tried. I was surprised at how calm I sounded. I envied the fairy changelings her belief that was biting, scratching, screaming boogeymen were just a bad dream. We edged nearer the naughty children. When we got close, the ones by the bar started grabbing at us and begging us to rescue them. It was horrible. If my dress hadn't been magic, they would have torn it right off me. Their hands were hot and sticky against my arms and face, and I had to keep pinching them to make them let go. The changelings went into a panic. scratching and slapping and screeching. Don't touch me! I do not like to be touched! At the top of her lungs, luckily the naughty children were already making so much noise that the boogeyman didn't hear her. Breaking free from the last of the clutching hands, I jumped down to the edge and crouched panting against the wall. A Louise Bear pile was a lot more terrifying when you were right down in it. A lot more dangerous, too. A barbed tail whipped at my shoulder. A clawed hand nicked my knee. I was too scared to move. With the one last do not touch me, the fairy changeling tumbled from the stage, picked herself up, and scurried off along the wall like a frightened squirrel. I ran after her, dodging, fighting boogeymen and hail of dried-out raisins towards the stage glimmer. Not a sign, exactly, but something like a shadow of sign. I was almost even with it when I cannoned into a large, warty chart to screen boogeyman. Hey, you guys, look! The boogeyman shouted. The naughty children are escaping. The noise got, if possible, louder. Carlyle's mind voice exploded in my head. Stop them! Stop them! I leaped for one of the mirrored panels and pushed. It swung open onto whistling darkness. The fairy changeling was behind me, her hands over her face, screaming. I grabbed her wrist. Do not touch me, she wailed, and wrenched herself free. A lot of folk don't like to be touched. Leprechauns, for instance, who have to give up their gold if you catch them. The Pooka, who had made a study of catching things that don't want to be caught, told me you have to grab folk from behind, pinning their arms if possible. This isn't easy as it sounds, particularly when you're in a hurry and scared out of your mind. But I managed to get a grip and drag my fairy twin backwards through the door. I could see the kanji sign now, and under it another sign that read, Carlisle Hotel, Madison Avenue. We were on the narrow platform beside a formless roar. It took me a breath to realize that we were in a between-way station. I'd never ridden the between ways. I never ridden the between ways. As I hesitated on the platform, I could hear a ruckus that sounded a lot like 300 boogeymen, plus a Louise, trying to get through a narrow door at once. Nothing ventured, as the Pooka often said, nothing gained. I stepped backwards onto the between ways, pulling the changeling with me.